Welcome to all of you. My name is Valerie Martinez, and I'm the Director of History and Literary Arts at the National Hispanic Cultural Center. Thank you for joining us for Tertulia Histórica Albuquerque, a collaboration between History and Literary Arts at the NHCC and the Office of the New Mexico State Historian. This monthly series features speakers who explore New Mexico history, its rich, tumultuous, and fascinating past, as well as current events that are making New Mexico history in the moment. History and Literary Arts is grateful to New Mexico State Historian Rob Martinez, our speaker today, who is a frequent speaker in this series and who's partnering with us to bring you relevant and interesting topics and speakers each month. Thanks also to Anna Uremovich. You see her in a little box there. She's one of our staff members, and she's been coordinating this series. And I want to thank the History and Literary Arts staff who make all of our programs possible. During normal times, this series would take place in person in our beautiful historic History and Literary Arts building at the NHCC. Because of COVID-19, we are here in the virtual world, and we thank you for practicing your technological prowess to join us today. Today's topic is Revolts and Revolutions, Resistant Movements in New Mexico History, and Rob is our speaker for today. Thank you again for joining us, and now I'm going to tell you a little bit about Rob. Most of you probably know him, but this is his formal introduction. State historian Rob Martinez is a graduate of the University of New Mexico with a BBA in International Business Management. He went on to pursue his interest in New Mexican culture and history at UNM, earning an MA in Latin American history with an emphasis on church, cultural, and social practices of the colonial period in New Mexico. Upon graduating, Rob pursued a teaching license and also worked for 14 years as a research historian for the Sephardic Legacy Project, scouring civil and church archives in New Mexico, Spain, France, Italy, Cuba, and Puerto Rico, analyzing documents for a research and publishing project about the crypto-Jewish phenomenon in New Mexico and the Caribbean. Rob was a teacher at Rio Rancho High School for 10 years, educating young New Mexicans about world history, New Mexico history, and language arts. Before becoming a state historian in 2019, he was deputy state historian for 6 years at the New Mexico State Records Center and Archives. Rob has published articles on New Mexico history, genealogy, and culture in numerous periodicals, and he has presented widely. Finally, as many of you know, Rob is also a folk musician, performing with his musical family in all parts of New Mexico and nationally, including at the Smithsonian Folk Life Festival in DC, the NEA's National Heritage Fellowship Awards, and the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. And so if you would all sort of clap your hands and welcome Rob, and I'm gonna make him the host of the meeting now. So it's going to take us just a few seconds.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Can you all hear me? Put your hand up if you can hear me and see me. All right. I'm Rob Martinez, State Historian of New Mexico. Bienvenidos. Welcome to Tertulia Histórica Albuquerque. Quick history about Tertulia Histórica. We created this series about 2 years ago at the Office of the State Historian to present New Mexico history and research at lunchtime sessions once a month. And it went really well. We would do it in Santa Fe, and we were cruising along doing it. And then something called COVID-19 came along and derailed everybody's plans, right? So we've all been doing different things from home and on Zoom and on computers. And I had been talking with Valerie and Anna actually for months before that happened about doing this in Albuquerque. And we will eventually do it at the Hispanic Cultural Center. But for now, we're here together apart as a community. And so that's the history of the Tertulia Histórica. I'm really happy that you're all here. Please spread the word. So let's see if I can get my PowerPoint up now. Okay, it says okay. Participant screen sharing. It doesn't want to let me. Have I been made a host?
There you go. How about that?
Let's try it again. See, there we go. All right, from the beginning. Okay, so today I want to talk about revolts and revolutions, resistance movements in New Mexico history. Before I get started, please note that this is not an all-inclusive list of events. There are ones I chose to look at. Please feel free to send me your suggestions to add for a later version of this talk. So let's get started. Riots. A riot is the language of the unheard. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. History is full of revolts, revolutions, resistance, and they're usually due to injustice that is being imposed from by one group to another group, and the latter group gets very tired of it and eventually struggles to get things changed. And when it doesn't happen, there's bigger consequences, we'll see. So let's look at some of these resistance movements. Clearly we all remember the movie Spartacus, the movie directed by Stanley Kubrick, featuring the amazing actor Kirk Douglas. Spartacus, that was a great movie based on actual history. Servile wars, these were slave revolts in the Roman Empire around 70 years BC. So we know that these slaves were obviously not happy with their situation. They were not happy with their Roman overlords. And there were a number of revolts and wars over this situation, slaves revolting against their masters. Obviously, one of the most world famous revolutions is the American Revolution in 1776, when the British American colonists got tired of being taxed without representation and being treated as second and third class citizens. And there were violent riots. There was destruction of business. Just go research the Boston Tea Party and you'll see what I mean. And there was even taking down of statues. In 1776 in New York City, a statue of King George was taken down and beheaded. The French Revolution of 1789 obviously was a revolt against the church, against the monarchy, against the nobility by the peasant population who got tired of paying most of the taxes and getting very little benefit from it. And so you had a revolution there in 1789. The Haitian Revolution is fascinating. In 1791, the black slaves revolted against their French overlords and established a free society. It took a while. That one took about 12 or 13 years, but it was the first time that slaves had revolted since Spartacus, and they were successful in removing French overlords and establishing a free society. Mexican independence, the country just to the south of us, we were part of it. They gained their independence after a revolution in 1821. It took 11 years. A priest started a movement in 1810, but it was put down pretty quick by the Spanish. But by 1821, the Mexican people were ready for independence. So these are resistance movements that have happened throughout history. So let's see what happens in New Mexico. Acoma, 1599. We've heard a lot about this recently with Juan de Oñate and some of the controversial statues here in New Mexico. Essentially, the Spanish had arrived less than a year before. They came in and proclaimed to the Pueblos that they were now their overlords and that they were now subjects of the King of Spain and were Roman Catholic. Well, we can see that there was probably a certain amount of getting along and accepting, but also waiting to see what the Spaniards were like. They were outsiders invading the Pueblo territories. So in 1599, Juan de Oñate, the adelantado of the Spanish colony, sent his nephew Juan de Zaldivar with some soldiers to collect some supplies from Acoma. Look at that picture. Look how fortified it is with that huge peñol, the cliffs to protect the community. Well, the soldiers were told to come up and get your supplies. It was winter time. As you can imagine, the Acoma people probably weren't that interested in handing out their food and blankets. So when the Spaniards got up there, they revolted. They attacked the Spaniards, killing some of them, including Juan de Zaldivar. This led to Juan de Oñate sending some of his soldiers to pay back the Acomans and bring them under Spanish control. Hundreds of Acoma people were killed. Soldiers of the Acoma Pueblo were maimed. They had their foot cut off. Women and children were put into servitude. A couple of Moqui Indians had their hands cut off and sent off as a warning. But this is not a good sign for the Oñate colony. The Pueblo people in general and the Acoma people specifically were in a state of resistance. It wasn't just the Pueblo people, though. Oñate had problems with his colonists. He brought about 400 with him. And a couple years later, they're right next door to San Juan Pueblo, Okeawinge now, and they're at San Gabriel El Yunque. And the colonists don't want to stay. They want to leave. A few want to stay, but mainly some of them desert. Oñate sends one of his captains to capture them and punish them, and they're beheaded. So this is a problem for Oñate because this leads most of the colonists to leave. This is a passive form of rebellion, but nonetheless, most of the colonists leave in 1601. A few stay, about 40 of the colonial families stay with names like Martin Serrano, the Martinez family, Montoya, Romero, Chavez, Baca, Holguin, those old families, and they stay. But the colony is on shaky ground because of these events. One of my favorite rebellions in New Mexico. Around 1637, a man named Luis de Rosas came up the Camino Real to become the governor of New Mexico. He was an arrogant and controlling and tyrannical man who exasperated problems with the Franciscan priests that were already in place between the priests on one side and the governors on the other, and the colony was split. Some of the colonists sided with the governor, some with the priests. Well, over the course of the next couple of years, he establishes an obraje in Santa Fe to put Apache and Navajo Indians to work as slaves, and he grabs some Pueblo people, which he wasn't supposed to do, and he does that to them as well. He has priests arrested. He challenges their authority in public, and finally in 1640, all the priests just leave and go to Santo Domingo to establish their authority there. This is a problem. Finally, the viceroy in Mexico City figures he has to investigate this, and so Rosas is actually arrested and put in a cell in Santa Fe to await his trial. Well, supposedly, he had been having an affair with one of the local colonists' wives. So in 1642, early January 1642, a group led by Antonio Baca broke into his cell. Supposedly, Luis Martin Serrano, my direct ancestor, supposedly knocked down the door. And this group of men go in, and Nicolas Ortiz, the man whose honor had been disrespected, killed Governor Rosas. About 2 years later, those men were brought to trial. Nicolas Ortiz was sent packing south to face a verdict, but he escapes, never to be seen again. But a few of the New Mexicans, Antonio Baca, Francisco Salazar, they're beheaded to be punished for this revolt against the Spanish governor and the government. One of the most famous, the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. This is a revolt, this is a revolution, and it has shockwaves and reverberations all the way down to Mexico City and even into South America. Essentially, 3 generations of Spanish rule were marred by, again, a lot of conflict between civil and church officials that found the Pueblo people caught in between. They're punished, they're abused, they're under the boot of the encomienda system, which forces them to pay tribute in the form of goods and labor to Spanish overlords. And in the 1670s, there's some problems. There's famine and drought, and some of the Pueblo leaders, they take to their kivas because they feel that they're becoming Catholic. They had abandoned their religion, and they felt they were being punished. So what happens is the priests and the Spanish soldiers, they take these spiritual leaders, these chiefs of the Pueblos, to Santa Fe and punish them by whipping them and also executing some of them. One of the survivors of this was Pope, an Indian of San Juan Pueblo. He goes back and he devises a plan to just get rid of the Spanish once and for all. So he coordinates all the Pueblos. Ultimately, they all participate except for a couple, Isleta in the south. And in August of 1680, the Pueblos revolt. They kill priests, men, women, and children, and drive the survivors to Santa Fe, where they trap them and ultimately force them to leave to go into exile in Guadalupe del Paso, now Juarez. So that is important because this shows that the Spaniards can be driven out, and the Spanish know they have to do something, because if not, word could spread to other native communities throughout the Spanish Empire, and the Spanish feared there might be more revolts. So ultimately, though, this is important because this forces the Spanish to reconsider some of the ways they were operating in New Mexico before 1680. But they know they have to retake New Mexico after the Pueblos revolt. The man chosen 12 years later is Diego de Vargas. He's from Madrid, Spain, and he's appointed governor of New Mexico. In 1692, he brings about 100 soldiers to Santa Fe to broker a peace, and he does. He brokers a peace. We have an idea what happened, but essentially he tells the Pueblo people that the Spanish are coming back. The Pueblos want to restart trade with the Spanish and also work with them to fend off Apache, Navajo, and then Comanche people who are coming in. And so we don't know what happened. The agreement is struck. It seems that the Pueblo people might have agreed to Spanish trade, of course, and maybe a military presence. But in 1693, Vargas returns with hundreds of colonists, some of those old survivors from New Mexico and some new recruits from Mexico City with names like Valdez and Aragon, Quintana, Mascareñas. And so he comes up, and the Pueblos won't let them in. They won't let them into Santa Fe. So Vargas and his soldiers, they have to take Santa Fe by force of arms. It's violent. The Pueblos are resisting Spanish presence in Santa Fe, and ultimately the Spanish retake the capital, but not after Vargas has a lot of the Pueblo warriors executed, which again leaves a bad taste in the mouths of the Pueblo people. The next few years we'll see the new or renewed colony is on shaky ground. More colonists come up to New Mexico from Zacatecas. These are Spanish and mulatto and mestizo people. But the colony is not stabilized. Vargas is a relentless warrior when he goes to subdue the Pueblos, but he seems to be quite peaceful in the aftermath. But nonetheless, some of the Pueblo communities plan a new revolt in 1696. This one is not nearly as successful. It's badly planned and badly coordinated, and about 3 priests are killed and about 21 Spanish settlers are killed. But after that, the Pueblos are settled, at least for the time being. But it just goes to show that the Pueblo revolt of 1680 had not been forgotten, and there was still resistance on the part of some Pueblos to being under Spanish rule. I'm kind of renaming this the Genízaro Revolt of 1760. The Genízaros were non-Pueblo Indians, Comanche, Apache, Navajo, Ute, these nomadic Kiowa, Pawnee warriors that would attack the Pueblos and the Spanish settlers throughout the 1700s. And the cautivos, the captives that would go in all directions, they would end up in Spanish households as servants and slaves. And ultimately, they would no longer be part of their native community, yet they were not totally Hispanicized. So they kind of lived in this in-between world and were put in places like Abiquiu or Belén, and in communities like Trampas and Truchas that were on the periphery of the colony to protect Pueblo and colonists from warriors, marauding warriors. So in 1760, a priest goes to Abiquiu and he is alarmed and writes a letter to a local magistrate saying that there's witchcraft and sorcery amongst the Genízaro Indians. And he blames a man named Miguel Ontiveros El Cojo, who was a Genízaro Indian, and his buddy Agustin Tagle. He claims that they're very powerful. They're in league with the devil. And he also names two women, Atole Caliente and La Come Gallinas, as powerful witches and sorceresses. And ultimately, what you see happening here is this Genízaro population, especially this group, they are in a full-blown challenge, revolt of Spanish religious authority and civil authority. It gets to be such a problem that the governor has to send the case to the Inquisition in Mexico City to deal with this. About 10 or 12 of these folks are arrested, and then they are put to work, essentially, as their punishment in Spanish households. The Inquisition doesn't get involved. The Inquisition stayed away from spiritual problems dealing with Native Americans, and even claimed that this was not witchcraft and sorcery. Rather, the Inquisition blamed the priest, saying he was not doing a good job, nor were the other priests in New Mexico doing a good job of Christianizing and evangelizing the Genízaros or the Pueblos, and that they needed to learn the local languages and do a better job. But this is an example of how witchcraft and sorcery in its real form and in its physical form was used to try to usurp the religious authority in a pueblo and the civil authority in the kingdom and province of New Mexico. Let's jump to our Mexican period, the Chimayo Revolt of 1837. We know that around 1836 or so, the Mexican government in Mexico City tried to centralize its power and authority by limiting the power of states and territories like New Mexico and imposing taxes. Well, that's never popular. The governor in New Mexico at the time was an outsider from Mexico. His name was Albino Perez. And so what happens is, we know what happens in Texas, the Alamo, the Declaration of Independence and separating from Mexico. Well, New Mexico doesn't do that, but New Mexico has her day when the people in Chimayo, they revolt to remove Albino Perez. He starts a counter movement, getting local soldiers to go up and put down this insurrection. But when they meet up around San Ildefonso, his soldiers join the revolt. And so he flees to Santa Fe, and with some of his buddies with names like Abreu and Saracino, they try to head south and get out of New Mexico. But around Santo Domingo, they're caught, and Albino Perez is executed. He's executed. They cut his head off and kick it around like a soccer ball. Some of the other guys, I think Abreu, they cut off his hands and feet, and while he was alive, dangled them in front of him. Kind of, yeah, kind of gross, I know, but that's history, you know. So this is a Chimayo Revolt of 1837 that temporarily puts a Gonzalez man from Taos, a Genízaro Pueblo man, as governor, but Manuel Armijo will have none of that, and he is taken out and executed. let's jump 10 years to our US territorial period. There's a Taos resistance. This is called the Taos Revolt, but I changed it. 1847, the people of Taos are, they're patriots. They're fighting for their country, Mexico. The United States has invaded the northern part of Mexico, including New Mexico. So from 1846 to 1848, Mexico was at war with the United States, which means New Mexico was at war with the United States. During this Taos resistance, some of the New Mexicans kill the territorial governor at the time, Charles Bent, and the American soldiers go into this area and they start taking New Mexicans prisoner and threaten to execute them as traitors. But the local priest, Padre Martinez, very famous priest, he wrote a letter to the US government saying, you cannot do this. These are not traitors. These are patriots fighting for their land, fighting for their homeland. You cannot do this. And he stopped that. But this is the Taos resistance of 1847 that ended with the death of a governor. I always remind people that in New Mexico, we have killed a governor under every flag that has flown over us so far. So this is the Taos resistance of 1847. The Mora resistance of 1847. This is a little personal because my family's from up in Mora. As you can imagine, the Americans were in Las Vegas. That's where they entered with Stephen Kearny in 1846. And they need to get to Taos because of the resistance going on up there. So US soldiers go into the Mora Valley around January of 1847, and they're met by the men of Mora, probably soldiers and fighters and farmers from other parts like Peñasco and over the places over the mountains. Well, they destroy the US force, killing most of the soldiers. Well, as you can imagine, the Americans cannot have this, just like the Spaniards could not have the Pueblo revolt, but the New Mexicans were revolting and resisting US presence. So about a week later, battalion of US soldiers goes into Mora and just burns the town to the ground. But again, I say Mora resistance because they were fighting for their country of Mexico, fighting for their families and for their land. So this was 1847. A year later, the war would come to an end and we would become a territory of the United States. I had to mention Padre Martinez of Taos. He's very famous, very popular, and very infamous. Not everybody loves this guy, but it's kind of personal for me because he's my great, 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 great uncle. My mom descends from his little sister. He was born in 1793 in Abiquiu, and then the family moves to Taos. He marries and has a kid, and the wife dies. Then he goes to Mexico, Durango, to study to be a priest. Think about this. He grew up when this was part of Spain. He went to Mexico to study when he was there when Mexico got her independence and we became part of Mexico. When he comes back, he's Mexican. And then he's here for the US-Mexican War. And then he will run into a conflict in the 1850s with our first bishop, later to be our archbishop. Lamy, a Frenchman who comes here and sees the local people as barely Catholic, barely Christian. He looks down on our adobe architecture, and he is not too happy with our local priests with names like Martinez, Ortiz, Baca. And so things are going okay until Lamy issues a pastoral letter where he has the priest tell the people of New Mexico if they don't tithe correctly, the priests are going to withhold sacraments like baptism and marriage and confession. And Martinez steps in. Martinez is very intelligent. He's trained as a canon lawyer, and he says, you can't do that. So there's a conflict here. Martinez is rebelling against Lamy. Martinez is excommunicated, supposedly, by Lamy, and this creates a faction in Taos and a bit of a schism in the local Catholic Church because of this. But ultimately, when the Jesuits come here in the 1860s, things are smoothed out. But it's a lasting legacy, your pro-Martinez and pro-Lamy factions. Lincoln County War, 1878. This is a conflict over economics. Two businessmen are in that area in Lincoln County. One is James Dolan, an Irishman. The other is John Tunstall. He's British. You're going to have a problem right there, an Irishman and a Brit. And in 1876 in Lincoln, they start to have conflict over who's going to have dominance of the business there, the business scene. There's a Sheriff Brady who sides with Dolan. And so they start to gather gang members from the Seven Rivers Warriors, Jesse Evans gang and the John Kinney gang. And Tunstall, he sides with a merchant named John Chisholm, and they recruit the Lincoln County Regulators. Well, 2 years later, 1878, Tunstall is killed, and this starts a war. This culminates in the Battle of Lincoln in 1878. The Dolan gang versus the Regulators. One of them is called Billy the Kid. His real name, we think, was Henry McCarty, and then William Bonney. A fascinating guy, but ultimately he breaks out, and Governor Lew Wallace offers a $500 reward for Billy the Kid, dead or alive. And ultimately, Pat Garrett goes and holds up in a friend's house in Fort Sumner. And when Billy the Kid shows up one night, shoots him dead right there. That's one of my favorite stories in New Mexican history. Oh, I love this. When I was doing the National History Day, I was participating in the National History Day at the National Hispanic Cultural Center a couple of years ago. I was sitting in watching some middle school students do their documentaries, and one young kid, he sits down and he puts up this documentary about families resisting having their land taken over by the U.S. government near White Sands. Well, I found the story of John Prather quite fascinating. John Prather was a muleteer. He raised mules with his brother Owen in that part of New Mexico since the early 1900s. They used to supply mules to the U.S. government and Mexican government during the two world wars. And he was a scrappy guy, John Prather. When the White Sands missile range started to expand and purchase land from farmers around him, people would ask him, "Are you afraid? Are you afraid of the missiles?" He said, "Afraid of missiles?" He said, "Hell no, I raise mules." So that was his response. So at one point, the U.S. military and government tried to strong arm him. They sent some armed men to get him off his land, and he and his family met them at the door. This is 1957, and he said, "I have coffee, beans, and cornbread. You can sit down and have some and leave, or we could settle this the way we need to settle it." And he pointed to a gun sitting near a sack of beans. And they decided to not have a gunfight with John Prather. He distrusted the missiles. He thought they were contraptions sent to intimidate him. And the government, to be fair, were quite accommodating of him. He stayed around there with his cattle, and he vowed to stay till he died. He said, "If they come to get me, they'll have to take my rifle from me." It was in 1963, though, that he got deathly ill and had to go to Alamogordo to live with a daughter. But I love that story of resistance. One man taking on the U.S. military and the U.S. government and winning. Tierra Maria courthouse raid, 1967. The 60s were full of riots and revolts and resistance around the world. Here in New Mexico, a Tejano, Reyes Lopez Tijerina, came here and woke a sleeping giant, telling the local people that he dubbed Indo-Hispanos, indigenous Hispanics, that you have land that belongs to you that the government stole. He studied the law. He studied our local land grants. He went to Mexico City to study in the National Archives. And again, when people try peaceful ways and it doesn't work, they usually try more effective, fantastic ways of getting attention. And so his group, the Alianza, they took over the courthouse at Tierra Maria in northern New Mexico in June of 1967. And it was a shootout. It made national news. There were Hispanics who sided with Tijerina. There were Hispanos who sided against him. My own father, Roberto Martinez, was a friend of Tijerina and wrote a corrido about those events, El Corrido de Rio Arriba. And I put this photo up. I love it. It's the National Guard was called out by Governor Cargo to get things under control. And there's a local man with his horse and the little baby horse. And he's clearly talking to some of these National Guard who are probably from Tierra Maria. They're probably from northern New Mexico. These people on different sides of a very controversial issue. But this is an example of violence and sensationalism being used to get the attention of the government. UNM student riots in 1970. There were student riots all over. We know about Kent, very famous and infamous events. Well, this all happened right here in New Mexico. I was a little kid at the time and was quite frightened, frankly. I'd watch the news and hear about the riots going on at Roosevelt Park, that there were police there and students were rioting. They were rioting to protest the Vietnam War, which many people felt was unjust and treated minorities unfairly, sending them to die for the country for no reason. So this photo says it all. This looks like this is a UNM campus. There's students standing their ground, and there are National Guard trying their best to hold the peace. Prison riot. This was a revolt, a riot in 1980 near Santa Fe, just south of Santa Fe at the prison there. There had been years of problems of overcrowding, of what some claimed were inhumane conditions, terrible food, as you can imagine. I know some people say, what's prison? You know, you can't expect good food. But nonetheless, there was finally a revolt, a riot in 1980. Guards were taken prisoner. Factions were created. There was a Chicano group, and then there was a Aryan movement group. They broke into the ward where informants were being kept, and ultimately this lasted about 36 hours and about 33 people died. About 12 of those informants were killed. One person was practically decapitated, and it was a brutal, vicious revolt and riot that ended up making changes in the prison system. If you drive by that prison now, you could still see it when you're driving north or south on I-25 to Santa Fe. And finally, I'm going to wrap up with what we're going through right now, the Oñate statue protests of 2020. Obviously, this was born of bigger issues in our country, dealing with statues in the Southeast, places like Georgia and Tennessee, statues to Confederate soldiers and people like Robert E. Lee, and the notion that these are not people who need to be glorified and put on a pedestal. Well, over here we have our own version with Juan de Oñate and Diego de Vargas, those conquistadores, some say, adelantados and settlers who did not treat Pueblo people well. So what we've had is this movement to have these symbols taken down and not put in the faces of the descendants of the people who were abused by Oñate and Vargas. And we see it with Kit Carson, who was a abuser of the Apache and Navajo people right here in New Mexico, and they're our fellow citizens. So we're in the throes of this Oñate statue protest. We're still going through this. We're still trying to figure out how we come out of this as a community. But we will, if history teaches us anything, we'll come out of this, and hopefully we'll come out of it better and in a healthier way, like our ancestors did in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, and early 1900s. Well, that's it for me. If you have any questions, put them in the chat box. That's my information there. If you want to contact me, Robert Martinez, State Historian of New Mexico. There's my phone number, my email, and go to our website. It's a work in progress, but we're always adding stuff and changing things up. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed my presentation. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Rob. It's wonderful to see everyone's faces. We're so glad to see you all. It's almost like having you in our chairs in our space.
And Anna, do you want to give people a preview of next month's?
Absolutely.
Yes.
So right now you can go to our NHCC website, nhccnm.org. Under events, you can register for our next presentation, which will be October 24th, 2 p.m. again. You'll receive your Zoom link, and we will be having Sylvia Ramos speaking on New Mexico and the suffrage movement.
And Sylvia is here with us. So Sylvia, I see you're great.
Hola, Sylvia.
Thank you,
Hola.
Rob. Thank you, Anna. Thank you so much, everyone. Rob, you did a great job. And we're just so happy to have you all. And hopefully we'll see you every month for this wonderful series. Bye.
Adiós. Hasta luego.